for the actual like Art of Noticing podcast that I've done and the companion pieces, one of the ones that I told you about, and this whole, because there's like 2,000 people here. It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's real easy to think about, well, what are the people that would be like, if this were a story, who are the main characters? But, there's a bunch of people that I would know, and those would be the people where I knew them ahead of time, and I made a punch list. I wanted to sit down with Joanna Penn and our other mutual friends. But then remembering that looking at all those people and seeing that every single one of those people has a story, and I will never know it.
Yeah.
I will never know that. And so I told you about when I learned the name of a waitress at a pub I go to, which is just like a throwaway thing, but it was relevant because it made me realize on a new level, deep down, rather than just top level intellectually, that this woman has an entire story and life, and the supporting characters, the background characters, the extras in the quote-unquote story of your life, they all have stories that's an endless source of inspiration.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 332 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is the AI voice of Mark Leslie Lefebvre, produced by 11 Labs. I'm using this technology to record the introduction because as I type this, I'm sitting in a Vegas hotel room without my fancy microphone and where the acoustics are far from ideal. The intro and the post-interview segment of this episode are going to be shorter than normal for that reason. Also, I'll be skipping reading comments from recent episodes or offering a personal update. This episode is sponsored by the awesome folks who support this podcast on Patreon. And a huge thank you to my wonderful family of supporters at patreon.com/starkreflections. Your investment in this podcast means a lot to me, so thank you. And of course, thanks to all of my listeners, because having you listening each week is also critical and means the world to me. For this episode, I had an impromptu sit-down right here in Vegas at the 20 Books Vegas conference with Johnny B. Truant after we got caught up in person for the first time in many years. Earlier at lunch that day, Johnny had started to tell me about his new solo podcast, The Art of Noticing, and I was fascinated with the premise and thought that you, dear listener, would enjoy hearing more about it through conversation. The audio is, given the location and the fact that it was recorded on my Android phone, less than stellar. But I'm sure you'll agree that the content and the conversation are going to provide you with something interesting to reflect upon. So without further introductory rambling, even if it is digital voice rambling, here's my conversation with Johnny. Hey Johnny, welcome back to the Stark Reflections podcast.
Thank you. Does this make me a regular that I've been on a few times
apparently,
now?
yeah.
Okay.
It's a very exciting. So today I noticed that it has been several years since you and I have been at a conference together.
Actually together.
And I mean, we've seen each other online, we've had lots of Zoom chats, etc. But I realized, and it wasn't that many years, maybe it was 5? 6
years?
It
could have been 5.
But it felt like 20.
Yeah.
Because I felt like, I got to have lunch with Johnny today and just chat. And it felt like whatever. So I noticed, one of the things that I noticed about that was that time can be very relative in terms of things that you enjoy. And you're like, I missed that, having that conversation, that in person. And yeah, we can have the conversations all the time on Zoom or whatever.
Yes.
So that was
and I noticed, anew, there's a noticing and a meta-noticing. I would say I noticed anew that an in-person conversation, how much better that is than a remote conversation, even if it's the same conversation, if you're in person. And then the meta-noticing is how easy it is to forget something that's really obvious, because I clearly know that, and I've always known that, but I forgot about it because it like atrophied.
Yeah, because the last time, I think it might have been at one of the Smarter Artist Summits in Austin that we were there in person, and I guess you haven't been to in-person events in many, many years.
No, I haven't.
So I guess I'm curious about your experiences as somebody who's coming back to that world of in-person networking after being heads down, writing, working on lots of different projects, like lots of projects, and even in going to, I mean, we talked in a previous episode about your experiences going to the set in Vancouver. I think it was.
It was Victoria.
Victoria, that's right. Sorry, much more beautiful spot. But I guess I'm curious about your observations of coming to a conference that you'd heard about but had never been to. There are people you know from past experiences, but then there's new faces, and how much has changed?
Well, so much. So are we sticking within the brand of noticing at this point?
Yeah, it's a conversation. Yeah, okay. We can notice things
because
or whatever.
I definitely do. Well, I notice and I'm reminded of a lot of things because I've come to so many of these in the past. Well, I've done so much in-person stuff in the past before this hiatus that noticing that. Well, so one thing that I thought was really interesting was that there are people who know me despite me thinking, well, maybe nobody would know me anymore because I've been kind of out of that teaching spotlight.
Yeah.
Because even, it would have been the last Smarter Artist Summit that we were actually hosting anything and actually speaking to people, but going to an event without hosting it is an entirely different thing as well.
Right.
And what I've found was a couple of things. One is, things change so quickly in this world that my knowledge and the fact that anybody would even know who I am is something that has a very short shelf life.
Yeah.
That there's new people out there as there should be, and there's new technologies out there, and suddenly I feel behind the curve and like I need to catch up. But similarly, I've found that it's interesting when you do run into people who you haven't seen and you aren't expecting to see. And I remember those things right away. One of the things we were talking about was just noticing anew how not important, it is important, but more how impactful it is when you remember something about somebody who you haven't seen in a long time. We were talking about remembering names and faces.
Yeah.
And if you're able to find somebody you didn't know really well and say, oh, hey, Joe, and you remembered their name and you didn't have extensive interactions, how impactful that can be.
Oh yeah, it's those little subtle things that actually, I mean, it's almost like this, I see you and I acknowledge that you have impacted my life somehow. I mean, it's a subtle thing.
Yes.
But it's a very powerful moment for someone, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And one of the things about the actual, so for the actual like Art of Noticing podcast that I've done and the companion pieces, one of the ones that I told you about, and this whole, because there's like, 2,000 people here? It's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And it's real easy to think about, well, what are the people that would be like, if this were a story, who are the main characters? Well, Mark Lefebvre would be one of them. Or I guess you're more Mark Leslie Lefebvre in this context.
Yeah, in this context. Maybe Johnny B. Truant's one of the main characters in this story.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly the main character because
sure.
I'm coming out from behind my own eyes. But, there's a bunch of people that I would know, and those would be the people where I knew them ahead of time, and I made a punch list. I wanted to sit down with Joanna Penn and our other mutual friends. But then remembering that looking at all those people and seeing that every single one of those people has a story, and I will never know it.
Yeah.
I will never know that. And so I told you about when I learned the name of a waitress at a pub I go to, which is just like a throwaway thing, but it was relevant because it made me realize on a new level, deep down, rather than just top level intellectually, that this woman has an entire story and life, and the supporting characters, the background characters, the extras in the quote-unquote story of your life, they all have stories that's an endless source of inspiration.
Yeah, I mean, there are 2,000 people here, and there are tens of thousands of stories.
Yes.
Right, when you think about all pulled from every single one. So one of the things is you reminded me of something that I remind myself. I'm a huge fan of Michael Connolly. I'm a huge fan of Harry Bosch. And Harry Bosch's slogan is everyone counts or nobody counts.
Yes.
And one of the things I remind myself of, I come to conferences, people want to talk to me, they recognize, because probably I've been on Joanna's podcast, right? That's usually where they know me from. And or that I work for Kobo or any of the things I'm with Draft Digital. So all those things are cool and people want to learn things from me. But I remind myself that there's not a single person here, even the person working the door who's not even a writer, who's a member, like whatever, there's not a single person here I can't learn something from, that I can walk away a richer person. And if I ever forget that everybody counts or nobody counts.
Mm-hmm.
If I ever forget that, because I'm focused on the main characters, I was like, okay, I got to talk to you. I want to meet I want Joanna, catch up with Jay Thorne. All the people I want to make sure I spend time with and talk to are valuable because these are friendships that I've maintained for a long time. But then there's value in the interactions with those other people that have richness to share. Mm-hmm. And that's something I constantly have to remind myself of, because I get focused on the main characters, the main cast. The main Cheers cast, as opposed to the extras in the background.
The people in the background.
Yeah. And that's such a... It reminds me when as a writer, there's characters you write that way that are richer than we even play with, I think.
Yeah. I mean, this whole thing, this entire conference experience is like this fertile ground of noticing. Because what I think, so the reason that I started doing the podcast in the first place is because this stuff is absolutely everywhere. Right. And it's real easy to go on autopilot and not pay attention to it. So when I was telling you about what I had done, I was like, why have I not, like every day I have a reminder, write down something that will eventually become a podcast episode that I've noticed. Yeah. And I thought, I'm in a new city, and why have I hesitated at all on, like, why have I had to think at all about something that I've noticed? Because there's so much stuff to notice here. But you go into that autopilot. Mm-hmm. Well, let me just, you don't notice. So, for instance, I have a yellow lanyard. You have a red lanyard. Yeah. Now, I mean, that is a perfect case of noticing, because it's literally, I'm not learning it. It's very obvious. I just notice it. Yeah. And who cares? But systems of like hierarchy, and I mean, it's kind of hierarchical, because you're a vendor and you're given...
has the red one, yeah,
you're given
I got into a special room where I had got a free lunch.
You got extra special stuff, and that denotes you. It's a symbol. It's like wearing a uniform. And those sorts of things exist everywhere. Somebody was telling me recently, I didn't know this, but I didn't know that Harlequin has like a color coding system, I believe, with the spines of the books, because one of my friends is a romance writer. And I didn't know that. And so people who know the code, they know that, that person's reading a really spicy one, because they know that it's, and I don't know but like if it's a red spine or something. But, the fact that, that was one of them, and I can't remember any others. But I was just, a second ago, you got to trust me that there were like 10 that I could have reeled off. And I forgot
that were just all related.
I forgot them. They were just right there. You can go back and you can edit them in later.
So, I was fascinated when you mentioned you had a new podcast, and that was kind of like, I call it the lean in moment. I think I leaned in, I went, you do? Tell me about your podcast. And then you described it, and I leaned in more and go, How did I not know about this? Because you had, like, I think you showed me, it was like episode 26 already.
Yeah, I haven't really publicized it much.
But it's 10-minute noticing, which I think is such a valuable, quick... we were talking with David Richmond and his podcast, Stop Making Yourself Miserable, which is like 10, 15 minutes. And it's like this parable or observation or something.
Quick hit. It's meant like a word of the day calendar.
Yeah.
Because we live in a magical, inspiring world, and I think people miss that because you're too preoccupied with the news or the next person that you need to meet at a conference. One thing that I noticed, I don't know that your listeners necessarily know this because they're listening, you're a rather tall person. And so, but I just saw you be made to look like a downright tiny person by the guy you were talking to.
Oh my God,
downstairs.
He was about 6'6" or something.
Oh, he was bigger than that. He was bigger. He was a very large person, and I was looking and I was watching you physically tilt your neck up to look at him, and I thought, that guy's got to be 7 feet tall and just a very large person, and he made you look little. So everything's relative.
Yeah, that's true. And I forget that I'm a tall person until I'm talking to someone taller than me.
Yes, and you're like, I'm not used to this motion. What is this lifting up motion?
Do I do this to people?
Things like the fact that we're in a hotel room. I'm looking at the carpet, and it's got this pattern. You never see plain hotel carpets, probably because they're constantly spilled on.
Yeah.
And you could draw something from that. That's a utilitarian thing that if you had like a story and you the idea that you're building in something is inevitable to happen. Is you wouldn't notice a stain on a carpet like this as much.
And when I see the carpet, when you pointed it out, I go back to being a kid. And I think about my little toy car
Driving
and driving
cars.
it on the tracks, which I used to do on rugs all the time. Although they had more of a pattern.
Well, like,
usually in
yeah,
my
like,
grandparents'
yeah,
place.
this is kind of a boring, this would be like, this is like Vegas streets right
Yeah,
now.
yeah, exactly.
But see, that's actually interesting too, because what I got out of it, what I noticed, was different from what you noticed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, not what, we noticed the same thing.
Yeah.
But you get a different lesson. To you it evokes nostalgia and play.
Yeah.
And for me it was like utility. It was
Or
thinking that
practicality.
all the little decisions that go into things, all the invisible decisions.
Right.
You know, it's like how you only get, I always get complained when I have to get a haircut, because I'm like, so I have to pay money to make it look the same?
Yeah.
Like, if I'm paying money, shouldn't I get something new? But that's the way this carpet is,
Right,
you don't notice it until it has utility to you, until it has meaning.
Right. Yeah. Oh, wow. And I love that fact, because you can, and that's why I call my podcast the Reflections. I'm always reflecting on stuff. And so I'm saying, I'm intuiting that you're noticing and reflecting on what you're noticing, and that's leading to 3 lessons usually in the episode. But I think about, you can notice a thing,
Right.
and go in this direction with where that takes you. I can notice same thing and go in a different direction, and then a listener can have a completely different one. So somebody thinking about the carpet isn't that they're imagining, based on our rudimentary description, what the carpet looks like, and that may take them somewhere else.
Right.
And there's magic in that, I think.
I think the world, one of the reasons I do it is because I think, like I said, I think the world can be a magical place, and I think it's really easy because we have the hierarchy of needs. What is red hot pressing for me right now?
Right.
What is in my news feed that's alarming me? And so when those things are handled, then, the tip of the pyramid is the self-actualization, the creative expression. We don't tend to notice those magical, inspiring things because we're too preoccupied with the lower parts of the pyramid.
Yeah.
And I like the idea of, it's meant to be a quick hit. Like, I imagine it being valuable to people who are literally looking for ideas, but I also think that it helps to cultivate a habit. If I'm noticing things and you're listening to this, and then you start noticing your own things, that's what you really want to do.
Yeah, yeah. So, where can people, what's the name of your podcast, that new podcast, and where can people find it?
It's called The Art of Noticing.
Right.
It is on just all the podcast directories, Spotify, Apple, wherever else.
And I do want to tease listeners, because you were talking about a new novel, Serializing, that you're working on. Can you just tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll include a link in the show notes?
Sure. So I'm doing an experiment with that. I'm serializing it on my Substack site. So by the way, if you're listening to this and you've never been to a Substack site, you just have to click the thing, say, I just want to read, I don't need to subscribe. It'd be great if you subscribe, but people get confused. They're like, what's going on with this website?
Okay.
So it's at my site, johnnybtruant.com, but I decided to serialize it on the website just as kind of an experiment to live write.
Yeah.
And so I'm writing it as, I haven't written it all, and I'm parsing it out. People are reading it as I'm writing it. And I'm doing that just kind of to be a poker in my back, to keep moving me forward and to see. I mean, I've done this sort of thing before, and I want to see if I can do it again. But you could also watch me fall on my face, which might be great too.
Yeah, and we'll notice something different every time we approach that, I guess.
I suppose, yeah. And it's a memory story. So memories being bought and sold, and that's the high concept stuff I like to do. Like, what is real? Is it live or is it Memorex? Reader probably too young to know what that means. What's Memorex?
All right, so leave a comment if you do know is it live or is it Memorex, if you understand that.
Yeah, we older people need some assurance that it isn't only young people out there in the world.
Awesome. Johnny, thanks so much for hanging out with me.
Thank you so much, Mark.
The first thing I wanted to share in terms of reflections is that I'm so looking forward to listening to Johnny's new podcast. The second thing is just how interesting it is to me that we can all notice the same something, but where we go with that something is where the most fascinating uniqueness lies. You saw that in Johnny noticing the carpet and where that led him, and how it led me in an entirely different direction. Where did our discussion of the carpet take you? What are some of the things that you noticed or paid attention to in the discussion Johnny and I just had? I'd love to hear your reflections and your thoughts in the comments at starkreflections.ca. And that's it for this episode. Thanks so much for listening. And so, until next week and next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre, or more accurately, the digital AI voice of Mark Leslie Lefebvre, wishing you great writing and good Stark reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.